Foreign Affairs, as well as Pakistan's ambassador to Turkmenistan and South Korea. In his first posting in Geneva, he was part of Pakistan's delegation when we joined the CCT. He was in Pakistan's delegation to Security Council during the 1971 war. As Additional Secretary UN, he participated in UNSC Resolution 1540 negotiations policy process. During India-Pakistan peace dialogue from 2004 and 7, he led Pakistan's delegation for three separate expert-level talks on nuclear CBMs, conventional CBMs, and the joint anti-terrorism mechanism. He was part of the negotiations that led to setting up the hotline between the foreign secretaries in 2004, the ballistic missile flight testing pre-notification agreement of 2005, and bilateral agreement on reducing the risk from accident relating to nuclear weapons of February 2007. He also took part in formulation of Pakistan's Strategic Export Control Division at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Today, he will be speaking on global arms control and disarmament operating environment. Our second panelist is Dr. Tariq Roof. Dr. Rauf is a member of Eminent Persons Group of Advancement of Nuclear Disarmament set up by Foreign Minister of Japan. He is the former head of verification and security policy at International Atomic Energy Agency and former alternate head of IAEA NPT delegation. He was non-proliferation expert with Canada's NPT delegation 1987 to 2000. He has been an official delegate at every NPT meeting since 1987. He drafted the strengthened review process for NPT agreed by consensus at 1995-2000 review conference. He was a senior advisor at 2015 NPT review conference to the chair of Main Committee 1 of Nuclear Disarmament. Today, he will be speaking on 10th NPT review conference, more of the same. Our third panelist is Dr. Zafar Nawaz Jaspal. Dr. Zafar Nawaz Jaspal is a professor of politics at School of Politics and International Relations, Qaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad. He is also a lead researcher of the program in Domestic and International Security Communications at the school. He holds a PhD and MPhil in International Relations and MA in Political Science. He did advanced postgraduate certificate courses in Peace and Conflict Studies from European Peace University, Austria, Peace Research, International Relations, and Foreign Policy Analysis from Oslo University, Norway. He also did CMC training course, Cooperative Monitoring from Sandia National Laboratories, New Mexico. Dr. Jaspal is widely published scholar with more than 110 academic research papers, monographs, and chapters in edited volumes published in Pakistan and overseas. He participated as a speaker in more than 250 national and international seminar conferences, workshops, group meetings, etc. His last book, India's Surgical Strike, Stratagem, Brinkmarkship and Response, assessed the strategic fallout of Indian military and political leadership's approach of adopting much tempered surgical strike, or in other words, hot pursuit stratagem against Pakistani armed forces, or so-called Mujahideen based inside Pakistani territory. Dr. Jaspal has carried out an in-depth analysis of India's military doctrine, its surgical strike gambit, and its implication on strategic stability in South Asia. Today, he will be speaking on disarmament, fool's paradise. Our last panelist is Mr. Muhammad Kamran Akhtar Malik. Mr. Malik is currently serving as Director General Arms Control and Disarmament at Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Pakistan. He has served as Pakistan's alternate permanent representative to IAEA, Vienna. He has worked as Director General, Science and Technology, OIC, Jeddah. He joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as a career diplomat in 1995, where he served in South Asia and Russia desks. Before joining Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he also worked at Pakistan Atomic Energy Commission. Mr. Kamran has participated in wide range of international negotiations on arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation issues. He has been part of several bilateral dialogues, including Pakistan-India nuclear and conventional CBMs, and has participated in several outreach dialogues with NSC and MTCR. Today, he will be speaking on nuclear disarmament between idealism and realism. So before we proceed further, I would like to mention that this webinar will be conducted in form of panel discussion, during which each panelist will be given 15 minutes. We request all our worthy panelists to kindly follow this time limit. If anyone is having trouble hearing or viewing the webinar or is facing any form of connectivity issues, please do mention this in the chat and we shall try our best to address these issues from our end. Kindly note that by default, mics of all attendees will be mute and only panelists will be allowed to use mic and video. If anyone from the attendants would like to ask a question, They are kindly requested to use the Q&A option to type out their question. Please do include your name as well as your organizational affiliation along with your question. The question will then be presented to our panel by the moderator during the questions and answer sessions accordingly. While we fully encourage you to participate, we request you to please be brief in your question. We shall try our best to ensure that all questions get answered within allotted time. We would also request panelists to kindly respond to questions within 2 minutes. Please further note that all opinions voiced at the SVI platform are independent opinions of speakers and audiences and not the official policy of SVI. This is an open house activity that will be reported in media. If anyone would like to tag or post screen grabs of this event on their personal blog, web pages, or social media, please do not forget to mention that webinar was organized by SVI. Thank you very much. Now I would like to invite Dr. Zafar Iqbal Cheema to give welcome and introductory remarks. Dr. Cheema, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dawood. Thank you very much for inviting me. At the outset, I would like to cordial welcome to our distinguished panelists who have kindly agreed to attend the webinar out of their very heavy engagements, especially Dr. Tariq Roof from Vienna, Austria, and my colleagues from Islamabad, Ambassador Tariq Osman Hyder, Dr. Jaspal, I hope he'll be joining us shortly, and Mr. Kamran Malik from Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I hope we will have an interesting discussion on the nuclear proliferation and disarmament. What is its current status at this moment? There's no broad understanding or agreement on what exactly is the non-proliferation regime. It's a very large network of international agreements, multilateral institutions, multilateral governmental institutions, and architectures, international architectures, whose chief, I think, element or component is the NPT, the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, which we all know very well, which was concluded in 1968 and entered into force in 1970. There was a principle behind the proposal for the NPT, and that was an Irish proposal in the UN General Assembly to work out an international agreement for controlling nuclear weapons, the proliferation of nuclear weapons as well as disarmament of nuclear weapons by those states which have already acquired nuclear weapons by that time. And the resolution said that there should be a balance of obligations by the non-nuclear weapon states not to acquire nuclear weapons and by the nuclear weapon state to disarm what they have acquired by then. But eventually, after a long process of 7-8 years, which came out in the form of the NPT, it was not the adherence to a principle. It was rather a kind of a bargain between non-nuclear weapon states not to acquire nuclear weapons and by nuclear weapon states to give up nuclear weapons or resort to nuclear disarmament in good faith, according to Article 6 of the NPT. The non-nuclear weapon states, of course, have undertaken their obligations which were to be verified by the safeguards to be implemented by the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency. Whereas the Article 6 of the NPT, which required the nuclear weapon states which were allowed to continue to develop nuclear weapons, they were not under that kind of verifications under which they would take undertaking within the language and within the context of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So eventually this has turned out to be a bad bargain in the sense that until today, the nuclear weapon states have not only not given up their nuclear weapons, but there are more nuclear weapon states which have come on the surface Other than P5, now we have T4, in which we have India, which we have Pakistan, we have Israel, we have North Korea, aspiring to acquire nuclear weapons, and many other countries which are parties of the NPT, but they are running clandestine nuclear programs, or they have aspirations to go nuclear, and they are developing their nuclear weapons program, and perhaps until they develop to a significant stage, they might come out of the NPT and declare their status of a nuclear weapon state, as it has been done by North Korea. So this is a dilemma which the non-proliferation regime or the NPT is facing. There are other very important issues which are concerning the NPTR, non-proliferation regime as we call it. We have a very distinguished panel, as I said earlier, as has been introduced by Khwaja Dawood. And I do not want to preempt any of their opinions by making some concluding remarks on that. So we will rather wait for the international experts which have joined us to kindly give their opinions about the various problems and prospects which have been listed against their name in that particular topic, that how the regime is facing these problems. So I refer back to Khwaja Dawood to kindly request each of the panelists according to the program that you have implemented.
Thank you very much, sir, for the very kind introduction. Our first speaker is Ambassador Tariq Osman Hyder. He will be discussing global arms control and disarmament operating environment.
Some results from the web.
Sir, I will yield the floor to Ambassador. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Always a pleasure to be back at the SVI and Dr. Cheema as well. The subject, global arms control and disarmament operating environment, poses 4 questions that I intend to concisely address. First of all, what is the framework of objectives that we should rely on for understanding what should constitute global arms control and disarmament? Secondly, in the global context, where are we at now and where are we heading towards? Thirdly, what is its situation in our region? Because that is what is most directly relevant to Pakistan. Fourthly, what lessons can we draw for Pakistan going forward? Now, looking at what frameworks we should rely on, the UN Special Session on Disarmament 1 in its principle encapsulates for most developing countries and certainly for Pakistan, what should be the enabling framework. I refer you to paragraph 22. Together with negotiations on nuclear disarmament measures, negotiations should be carried on the balanced reduction of armed forces and of conventional armaments based on the principle of undiminished security of the parties with a view to promoting or enhancing stability at lower military level, taking into account the need of all states to protect their security. These negotiations should be conducted with particular emphasis on armed forces and conventional weapons of nuclear weapon states and other military significant countries. There should also be negotiations on the limitations of international transfers of conventional weapons based on the same principle and taking into account the inalienable right to self-determination and independence for peoples under colonial or foreign domination and the obligation of states to respect this right in accordance with the Charter of the UN and the Declaration of Principles of International Law concerning friendly relations and cooperation among states, as well as the need of recipient states to protect their security. That gives us the context and foundation on which Pakistan and other developing countries should base their approach towards. Secondly, where are we at now and where are we heading towards? To seriously move towards arms control and disarmament, it's first necessary to identify where we are at now in terms of global and regional levels of tension, security situations, and threat perception. In a world where the operating environment is disturbing and does not lend itself to advances in the goals of all countries have ostensibly professed as common objectives, global arms control and disarmament. All the trends are in the wrong direction. great power rivalry has reemerged. Three major powers, the USA, Russia, and the UK, are either modernizing or increasing their nuclear arsenals or doing both. Most recently of these developments is the UK's decision under its integrated review to increase its nuclear weapons stockpile. The overall cap in the number of warheads will now increase to 260, having been due to drop to 180 under previous plans from 2010. Apart from being at variance to commitments towards vertical deproliferation under the NPT, which Dr. Cheema just pointed out, this will also have an impact on the other nuclear powers. Hand in hand with the modernization of nuclear weapons, establishing new weapon systems, hypersonic systems, and ABMs are being deployed along with new doctrines to fit these new systems. Doctrines which can either be unabashedly offensive or overtly defensive, though covertly also offensive. The case in point is ABM systems. Ostensibly, their purpose espoused and projected by both those who deploy them and those who sell them, that they are defensive in nature, aimed at giving a certain sense of security as they would be able to sufficiently withstand a nuclear attack to be able to retaliate, which would thus deter any such first strike. However, a strong enough nuclear shield may cause a country to calculate or miscalculate that it can mount a first strike as it would be able to withstand a depleted retaliation strike. Regional asymmetries and destabilizing buildups in both the strategic domains continue apace with the involvement and assistance of extra-regional powers driven by strategic, commercial, and realpolitik interests. Offensive rather than defensive doctrines are increasingly adversely affecting strategic stability. Emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, the integration of cyber technologies for offensive purposes, autonomous weapon systems, space-based systems have been added to the militarization toolkit. One would have thought that as the COVID pandemic has been ravaging the world, the global vulnerabilities would encourage countries to refocus on surmounting the underlying systemic problem. Underdevelopment in many countries and rising inequality everywhere, including in developed and well-off countries. The pandemic has thrown into relief that living or dying in this immediate phase depends on equitable access to vaccine, but in the long term, partly on resilient and adequately funded public health system. Yet there has been unprecedented research and innovation, global cooperation to meet these challenges with the swift emergence of multiple vaccines, a new mechanism of COVAX to fund and distribute vaccines where most needed. And while it is welcome, COVAX meets only part of the global need. However, there's been no thought on the need to create conditions not only conducive to, if not disarmament, then at least to arms control, to the reduction of tension, which would lead to less expenditure on defense, which could be redeployed for public health systems, equal opportunity, education, and wider, more generous social security nets for the most vulnerable, the poor, children, the elderly, women, and the handicapped. But that has not happened. There has not even been a contemplative pause in strategic thinking, nor is there sufficient awareness at the global level among civic society without which it would not impact policymakers. They can only be progressed towards arms control and disarmament of the security concerns of states and international disputes to address conflicts diffused and the right of peoples to self-determination and independence from foreign occupation is respected. What is the situation in our region? These negative global security trends have darkened the security landscape in South Asia. Pakistan is facing a growing existential threat from India's increasing conventional and strategic capabilities that are being strengthened by extra-regional powers for their strategic and commercial objectives. Terming India as a net security advisor further enhances India's intransigence towards Pakistan and the brutality of its occupation in Jammu and Kashmir of the Kashmiri people. India's development of MIRVs, acquisition of ABM systems, including S-400s, canisterization of missiles to increase their readiness, deterrent patrols of nuclear submarines with loaded and pre-mated nuclear missiles ready to fire, forces Pakistan to consider the possibility of a counter-force preemptive first strike by India, which has been discussed and recommended, by many of its thinkers, including former officials and academicians. India's land doctrine of 2018 and joint doctrine of 2017 outline the integration of limited warfighting concept and assert that conventional war will remain central in the spectrum of operation in response to Pakistan's constant attempts to shrink space for conventional wars. India, I'm quoting there, India continually strives to create space for war to circumvent the strategic stability created by both countries going nuclear, despite its recognition in 2014 in the joint communique after the first round of expert-level talks on nuclear CBM to that effect that going nuclear by both countries enhances strategic stability. The Indian escalation of 2019 February during the Pulwama crisis reflects an aggressive and dangerous mindset. India can try to punish Pakistan short of Pakistan resort to an intensification which may go nuclear at some stage. India's belief that it can mount a conventional conflict without the risk of nuclear escalation needs to be discouraged by Pakistan and by the international community. In this region, it is clear that for Pakistan to progress on arms control and disarmament, it cannot be delinked from threat perceptions and security challenge and our nuclear deterrence, which holds a no first use doctrine. No first use for a conventionally inferior state is an invitation for conventional aggression. That is why India has mounted a campaign to make no first use an international norm and to work towards a legal treaty towards this end. In brief, the security landscape in South Asia is being stabilized by conventional asymmetry, the continuous expansion and modernization by India of its conventional nuclear assets and capabilities, induction of destabilizing weapon systems, as well as force postures and aggressive war-fighting security strategies and war planning. Fourthly, what lesson can we draw from Pakistan going forward? In our operational environment, the gearing ratio differential in conventional arms and technology continues to grow to our disadvantage. Arms and technology supplied by external powers adds to this imbalance. External powers continue to directly and indirectly augment India's strategic capabilities and adversely impact strategic stability. However, Pakistan's nuclear deterrence capability continues to meet this challenge, and so does our conventional capability. That is the first lesson we should draw, is to maintain this deterrence. The second lesson that is many times recognized and not acted upon, our security depends on implementing a number of long-term political policy and measures which are well-known: political stability, national consensus on important issues, improving economy, global competitiveness, improving education and educational opportunities across the spectrum, not just higher education, long a favorite, law and order, justice, public health, regional connectivity, and widening social security net. The third lesson is to continue to protect and project our national interests in international region forums in our bilateral relationships as well. We have long tradition of doing so in the Conference of Disarmament in Geneva, First Committee in the UNGA in New York. We must continue to focus on our campaign to join the NSG and at another level strive for non-discriminatory access to dual-use technologies. Further cooperation between our nuclear regulatory authority, the PNRA, with its foreign equivalent, is long overdue, considering that an agreement was reached with the USA Nuclear Regulatory Commission in 2004. The fourth lesson is to more deeply study in India and how best to deal with it. In the context of the Kashmiri struggle, how best to support it and how to continue the momentum of bringing India's annexation and human rights repression to the international community and global civic society. The need to step up further the counterterrorism and to counter Indian support for terrorism and insurgency, which is an integral part of its objective to destabilize Pakistan from within as part of its overall military strategy. On the nuclear and conventional side, we've been proposing modalities and mechanisms. CBM is based on the Lahore MOU of 1999, but since 2008, India has not accepted any such proposal, which range from our first and overarching proposal of a strategic restraint regime with its three interlocking elements of nuclear restraints, including no ABMs, conventional balance and dispute settlement, to non-deployment of weapons above a certain caliber across the LOC. Despite the reiteration of the 2003 ceasefire by the two DGMOs, the situation is not clear as to the future format and scope of talks and what preconditions will be required. In case nuclear and conventional CBM talks are cleared, there are a number of aspects we could retake up, including our proposal to avoid incidents at sea, which had gained some traction. Also on threat perception, there's a PIST called for under the Lahore MOU, especially as India, whose majority of forces are ranged against Pakistan, keeps asserting that its major arms acquisition are geared towards China. In conclusion, I turn to existing CBM as their continuation is not a matter of debate or unclarity. The DGMO's hotline and its use has been in use for some time. In the 2004 nuclear talks with India, it was inter alia decided to set up a hotline between the two foreign secretaries and to upgrade the transmission line between the DGMOs at the same time as the foreign secretary's line. It's high time for Pakistan to activate and institutionalize that foreign secretary's hotline. Secondly, the agreement on pre-notification of flight testing of ballistic missile. This agreement is being used being in the main observed. However, India maintains an ambiguity about launches by submarine. There is no justification for any ambiguity under the agreement. If it is not clarified, it would hypothetically permit India to launch a first strike or decapitation strike from a nuclear submarine in the sea. We should ask India to clearly remove any ambiguity on the score, and if it does not do so, withdraw from the agreement. I thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. It was a very comprehensive presentation. Our next guest is Dr. Tariq Roof, who is going to speak on 10th NPT review conference, more of the same. Dr. Roof, the floor is all yours, sir.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be joining an event with SVI, and I'm also very pleased that I have such distinguished colleagues on this panel. I'm just trying to get this slide going, and I hope you can see it. So it sort of started at the wrong one. So can you see the slide, Khwaja?
Yes, sir. We can see the slides.
Okay, thank you. So we had a very comprehensive introduction by Dr. Zafar, and also a very comprehensive presentation by Ambassador Tariq Osman Hyder. In my presentation, since I was asked to speak specifically about the NPT review conference, I will start with a very brief overview of where we are with regard to nuclear weapons and quote-unquote nuclear proliferation, say a few words about the Non-Proliferation Treaty review process, introduce some of the competing approaches that are on the table with regard to moving forward on nuclear disarmament, and conclude with some comments of my own regarding the NPT and its review conference. So if we look at the global threats landscape, until last year, the highest threat with the greatest consequence was that of weapons of mass destruction, in particular nuclear weapons. But of course, since March of last year, infectious diseases, that is COVID-19, has also joined this, as well as climate change. So we are facing three big existential threats today from infectious diseases: COVID-19, which is a pandemic, a polypandemic that is still continuing unchecked. 70% of global vaccinations have only taken place in 10 countries. There are many countries in the developing world where not a single person has been able to be vaccinated. We have vaccine nationalism, where the rich countries are hoarding vaccines many times greater than their needs. And also they are not permitting the breaking of the patents and allowing generic copies of the vaccines to be manufactured. So this shows the selfishness, or a Hobbesian international system still continues. Climate change, I don't need to say very much about it. It's all obvious. Everywhere the world is getting hotter. Last year was the hottest year on record. And as Ambassador Tariq Osman Hyder mentioned in his presentation, we already are facing a much more dangerous world, and I'll have a few more words about this. Just to remind you that the nuclear age started in 1945 with the Manhattan Project, which was a multinational project. There were scientists from many different countries, so was not a national project in terms of the science. It was a national project in terms of the funding. So to say that the nuclear weapon program of the United States is indigenous is not correct. This was followed then in 1949 by the Soviet Union, in 1952 by the United Kingdom, 1960 by France, 1964 by China. And the countries whose names you see in square brackets are the ones that helped these countries develop their nuclear weapons programs. We understand that in the June 67 war, Israel activated its nuclear weapons, and it's suspected to have been a part of a secret clandestine nuclear test that took place in the South Atlantic in September 1979 with South Africa. South Africa acquired nuclear weapons in 1983, as far as we know. India detonated this first device in 1974 and then came out in the open in 1998, which then provided Pakistan the opportunity to match India and also carry out its series of nuclear tests. And finally, the latest country to join the nuclear club, which has happened in this century, was the DPRK, which conducted its first test in 2006 and the last one in 2017. So I always point out in these presentations that every country that has developed nuclear weapons has either received help and or given assistance to another country in developing nuclear weapons. So no country has clean hands, so to speak. With regard to nuclear testing, we've had more than 2,000 nuclear explosions, which include both military and peaceful nuclear explosions. And as you can see from the map, they have been conducted all over pretty much the surface of the Earth, and as well as underwater, above water, and even in space and in the atmosphere as well. So with regard to nuclear weapons, it's estimated that we have roughly about 13,500 nuclear weapons, which are deployed at 107 sites in 14 countries. This includes 5 countries in Europe that host United States battlefield or tactical nuclear weapons. In addition, we have the overhang of 1,400 metric tons of highly enriched uranium and 500 metric tons of plutonium usable for weapons. This is roughly 1,900,000 kilograms of weapon usable material, and it only takes 25 kilograms or less of highly enriched uranium or 8 kilograms or less of plutonium to make one nuclear weapon. We also have 5 regional nuclear weapon-free zones and 1 state that is a single state nuclear weapon-free states, and that is Mongolia. So the entire southern hemisphere below the equator is covered by nuclear weapon-free zones, and there is 1 nuclear weapon-free zone in the northern hemisphere, which is among the 5 Central Asian countries, and then the single state nuclear space of Mongolia. So I usually show this slide, which it is not entirely accurate now, it's a little bit dated, that every country that has acquired or has ambitions to acquire nuclear weapons had a dedicated nuclear weapons acquisition program and did not divert or misuse their peaceful nuclear program. And this is basically to point out, to guard against opposition to civilian nuclear programs that is emerging. And there is a securitization of the discussion on the peaceful uses of nuclear energy and the inalienable right to use nuclear energy, which was referred to by Ambassador Tariq Hyder. So as Dr. Zafar pointed out in his introduction, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was negotiated in the 18-nation Disarmament Committee, which was one of the predecessors of the current Conference on Disarmament, entered into force in 1970, was extended indefinitely after its initial 25-year period of being in force in May 1995. There are only 4 countries that are outside the treaty. 3 countries never joined: India, Israel, and Pakistan. South Sudan is a new country that emerged about 3 years ago, and the DPRK, North Korea, is the only country to have ever withdrawn from the treaty. So this is generally regarded as the cornerstone of the nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament regime. And also the non-proliferation treaty is considered to be the most successful multilateral nuclear arms control treaty in force today. So as far as the definition of a nuclear weapon state is concerned, for the purposes of this treaty, it is defined as one that carried out a nuclear explosion, whether it was civilian or so-called peaceful explosion or a military explosion before the 1st of January, 1967. Again, as Dr. Zafar Cheema mentioned in his introduction, Article 6 is the one that deals with disarmament. It's the shortest article in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it is also one that is subject to differing interpretations. So you can see that there is a comma in the 4th line after nuclear disarmament. For the nuclear weapon states, their position generally is that they can only undertake nuclear disarmament in the context of general and complete disarmament, and the two are inextricably linked. And therefore, the nuclear weapon states under the NPT are putting the burden or the onus of nuclear disarmament on the non-nuclear weapon states to create a situation where the nuclear weapon states feel that they no longer need nuclear weapons. The non-nuclear weapon states, for the most part, argue that in Article 6, there are two distinct, although linked commitments, one on nuclear disarmament and one on general and complete disarmament, and nuclear disarmament is not dependent on achieving general and complete disarmament. So this controversy carries on to this very day in the NPT context. The Non-Proliferation Treaty was the first one to introduce a review process so that the majority of states which have given up something, that is the right to develop nuclear weapons, could hold the ones that are obligated to give up nuclear weapons, but there is no timeline accorded for that in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I should also point out that NPT review conferences are not a forum to resolve global nuclear disarmament differences or to negotiate nuclear arms control treaties or various other measures. Review conferences are a forum to review the implementation of the treaty across its 3 pillars. Pillar 1 is disarmament, Pillar 2 is non-proliferation, including safeguards, and Pillar 3 is peaceful uses of nuclear energy. So we have had review conferences since 1975. 5 of these have succeeded in agreeing to a final document. 4 of them have failed. The review conference in 2000 was the only one that agreed by consensus to a review of the period between 1995 to 2000 and on recommendations and benchmarks for implementation in the period from 2000 to 2005. The other review conferences only agreed on what is called the forward-looking components, but not on the review part of the mandate of the review conference. So in 1995, when the treaty was extended indefinitely, one of the decisions was on principles and objectives for non-proliferation and disarmament. This included the benchmark to complete the negotiations on a comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty by 1996, and that in fact did happen, for immediate commencement of negotiations on a fissile material cutoff treaty and a few other provisions on moving on disarmament that were not very specific. In 2000, in the final document, for the first time, the nuclear weapon states made a concession and they separated the reference, as I mentioned, in Article 6. So they made a specific, unequivocal undertaking for nuclear disarmament, which was not linked to progress in parallel on general and complete disarmament. It also called for entry into force of the nuclear test ban treaty, fissile material cutoff treaty negotiations, irreversibility in nuclear arms control, reducing the role of nuclear weapons, reducing the number of non-strategic nuclear weapons, the nuclear weapon states to report on what they have done on nuclear disarmament, and also verification both of non-proliferation as well as of nuclear disarmament. The next conference, the last one that succeeded in agreeing on an outcome, was the 2010 review conference, which agreed on 64 actions, of which 22 concern nuclear disarmament. But in several respects, this was a weakening of the agreement that we had reached in 2000, because some of the things that we had asked for in 2000 had not been implemented, had been overtaken by events, by new technologies. A new nuclear arms race was brewing, something that Ambassador Tariq Osman Hyder referred to in his presentation. So the review conference was supposed to have been held last year in April and May, marking the 50th anniversary of the NPT's entry into force. But because of the COVID pandemic, it was postponed to be held in January of this year and then postponed again to be held in August. And so currently it's scheduled to be held in August in New York. So the contentious issues will be, of course, the Middle East nuclear weapon-free zone issue, but of course, nuclear disarmament, as well as the humanitarian initiative that led to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or the TPNW. There are a number of other issues which are also contentious at every review conference, but the ones on which the review conferences have failed and will fail in the future are, of course, nuclear disarmament and also the Middle East zone free of nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction. So the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons entered into force on the 22nd of January after 50 states had ratified it. 86 countries have signed. Now, this treaty was negotiated in 2017 under the mandate of the General Assembly of the United Nations, and it was negotiated using the rules of procedure of the General Assembly. So all members of the United Nations were free to join the negotiations, but the 5 nuclear weapon states and the 4 other states with nuclear weapons chose not to join the negotiations. So they were not excluded. This was their deliberate decision to boycott and to oppose these negotiations. So in my view, they are not on very solid ground in criticizing the treaty as not including them, because they excluded themselves. They were not excluded by the negotiators of the treaty. There are other criticisms that we can address in the question and answer session, given time limits for my presentation. So in 2018, the United States launched a new initiative called, at that time, Creating the Conditions for Nuclear Disarmament, where they disavowed all previous agreements in the NPT from 1995, from 2000 and 2010. As I have just alluded to, they put the onus on the non-nuclear weapon states that they should create the conditions under which the nuclear weapon states would feel comfortable enough to disarm. I have been a critic of this from day one, and I call it dreaming of rainbows, butterflies, and unicorns, a fool's errand. I can discuss that later. So what's the Creating the Environment for Nuclear Disarmament, as it was renamed in 2019, or CEND? It involved about 42 countries. So it included the 5 nuclear weapon states. They also invited Pakistan, India, Israel, and a number of what I call captive nations or client states. These are countries of NATO and other countries that rely on US nuclear guarantees or extended deterrence. So they have set up 3 working groups. One is to discuss threat perceptions involving nuclear weapons, why countries acquire nuclear weapons, and why countries give up nuclear weapons, as if we don't know. Given the historical record where South Africa has given up nuclear weapons, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine renounced the nuclear weapons that were on their territory following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The second working group is best practices for improving discourse in international forums. But the countries who are disrupting discourse and losing civility are the nuclear weapon states themselves. And then the third working group is on nuclear risk reduction. Again, this is an oxymoron because it's the nuclear weapon states themselves developing these new destabilizing technologies that Ambassador Tariq Osman Hyder referred to: hypersonic delivery systems, low-yield nuclear weapons, prompt global strike, and so on. So again, from my point of view, CEND is not creating the environment for nuclear disarmament. It is creating the environment to never disarm. So what are the reasons which are creating the environment to not disarm? We actually have a collapse, basically, of the Cold War nuclear arms control structure. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty collapsed in 2002. The INF Treaty was finished off in 2019. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty has not entered into force. Although the New START Treaty has been extended for 5 years till 2026, we have no follow-on negotiations between the United States and Russia. The United States now insists on having China at the table. China rejects that. We don't know what will happen at the review conference of the NPT. The Nuclear Weapons Prohibition Treaty has become very controversial. Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty or a Fissile Material Treaty is nowhere in sight. The Iran Agreement or the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is also close to collapse, although starting tomorrow, there will be proximity talks between the United States and Iran through the good offices of the European Union. And now, for the first time, there are no ongoing negotiations between the 2 largest possessors of nuclear weapons, Rather, their policies are now positing early use of small nuclear weapons to achieve decisive results. Russia, which is now has weaker conventional forces, has a new doctrine of early escalation to a nuclear level to de-escalate a conventional conflict where the Russians might be losing. And as we can see from the Indian attack across the line of control in Kashmir in 2019 and the Pakistani response, there is also perceptions of increased risk-taking between India and Pakistan. So the dangers of inadvertent, accidental, or even deliberate use of nuclear weapons are now considered to be higher than they were during the Cold War. And now a new Cold War has been started, particularly by the United States against China and Russia, which the way the trends are going is going to become worse before it becomes better. The US is now firmly opposed to reiterating the Gorbachev-Reagan dictum that a nuclear war cannot be won and thus must never be fought. And then, as Ambassador Tariq Osman Hyder mentioned, all of the multilateral disarmament forums are deadlocked and suffer from divisive debate. And as I mentioned, there is now a rollback in the NPT context of the commitments made by the nuclear weapon states themselves, even though we have to give credit that the two largest possessors have reduced nuclear weapons by 80 or 85%. Although just 2 weeks ago, the United Kingdom announced that it would increase its nuclear weapons from 180 to 140, which is a 44% increase. And also, the United Kingdom relies on nuclear warhead designs for its submarine-launched nuclear deterrent, and the missiles on British nuclear submarines are leased from the United States. So this is a clear violation of Article 1 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So coming to its end, we have a number of competing approaches to nuclear disarmament, which I call confusing the environment. So the non-aligned movement still has its time-bound plan of action, which keeps on shifting. 25 years now, people are talking about an end to nuclear weapons by 2045, which would be the 100th anniversary of the invention and use of nuclear weapons. Many of the Western states, including the NATO countries, United States and Canada, still are wedded to the so-called step-by-step approach. So for them, the next logical step is a fissile material cutoff treaty, but they do not want to include existing stocks. And as I mentioned in an earlier slide, we have 1,900,000 kilograms roughly of weapon usable material that, in my view, needs to be captured in any future fissile material treaty. There is another initiative with countries like Japan, the United Arab Emirates, Mexico, and some others called the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Initiative. Critics call it the procrastination and delay initiative. This is basically a version of the step-by-step approach referred to as building blocks. The new agenda coalition that was set up by Sweden, Ireland, and Egypt in 2000 has been weakened, but their approach in taking forward multilateral negotiations to nuclear disarmament, in a sense, led to the TPNW, but they too are a little bit disoriented at the moment. Sweden came up with its latest proposal 2 years ago called the Stepping Stones to Nuclear Disarmament, which is another version of building blocks and the step-by-step approach. And the United States has had this creating the environment for nuclear disarmament, which I gather, fortunately, will die under the Biden administration. So what are the futures for the NPT? Some people have talked about muddling through, as we have done, or if the current discord continues, where now the nuclear weapon states, particularly the United States, China, and Russia, are fighting bitterly in the NPT review process, which they didn't used to do before. Or shall we have a construction for the future where we try and bridge the differences and find agreement where we can? I still recommend that Pakistan should go back to attending NPT review meetings as a observer state non-party. Actually, I met Ambassador Ahmad Kamal for the first time when he was at the 1995 NPT review conference. In 1997, when I started the so-called Annecy meetings, at that time, Ambassador Munir Akram was the PR to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, and he came to these meetings that I organized, where we also had his Indian counterpart on the panel. And Ambassador Munir Akram had a very good proposal at that time of a protocol to the NPT that would find a way of bringing in or associating Pakistan and India with the Non-Proliferation Treaty by accepting the provisions on nuclear disarmament and then also opening the door for civil nuclear cooperation. So I have also been arguing to move the review conference from New York to Vienna because the expertise for review conferences for Pillars 2 and Pillars 3 on verification and peaceful uses always has been in Vienna, and the expertise on nuclear disarmament resides in Geneva. New York is basically a talk shop where they don't have this expertise, but unfortunately the NAM coordination for the NPT sits in New York, and they still insist on having this meeting. He came close to the brink in terms of false warnings of nuclear attack from Russia or Soviet Union at that time. And then there is the Blix Commission report called Weapons of Terror. So with that, I'll end my presentation, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tariq Roof. It was a very, very comprehensive presentation. For the next presenter, let me first welcome Dr. Zafar Nawaz Jaspal. So welcome to the webinar.
Thank you.
So Dr. Jaspal will be speaking on disarmament in food's paradise. Sir, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. Indeed, it's a great pleasure to listen Professor Cheema, Ambassador Tariq Osman, and Dr. Tariq Roof. All of these three are experts in our field, especially in the nuclear field. So it's a great pleasure to listen to them, and certainly I learned a lot. Having said this, when we are talking about this nuclear disarmament or disarmament as a fool's paradise, it's a very interesting question. But at the same time, if we see preventing arms race, which could lead to nuclear war, is one of the most fundamental challenges facing human civilization in the current environment. The most important point here is because arms race, if there is an absence of arms control, and especially lesser thinking or no thinking about disarmament, then it means that the strategic environment is very much polluted with certain dynamics which cause instability. When we are looking about these kind of the things, especially after Pulwama incident in February 2019, one cannot underestimate this debate which is taking place, that whether this tradition of non-nuclear weapons will be giving a way to selective use of nuclear weapons, or famously what we call it nuclear taboo. But at the same time, we are very much confident that since 1945, in the nuclear age, attempts have been made. And that's why, if you see the history, around 12 laureates have received the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts to reduce the dangers associated with the nuclear weapons. They all argued that nuclear weapon is too indiscriminate and destructive to stay in the arsenal of states in case it will probably be used, likely leading to nuclear Armageddon. The fear of indiscriminate nuclear devastation has called for complete nuclear disarmament. The demand for nuclear disarmament, of course, is not a recent, it has been there since 1946, first sort of thing. Recently, if we see that the nuclear pessimists gain some kind of a strength in their argument, or especially the proponents, if you see the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, it is viewed as a breaking a path towards nuclear disarmament. However, critics argue that it is unlikely to reach its stated objectives. After this TPNW, people started thinking that there is a possibility once again, or to be optimistic about the nuclear disarmament. That raised a question: is nuclear disarmament possible? This kind of a situation, whether it's workable, feasible, or hypothetically speaking, that it's impossible. It reminds us of the famous speech of President Obama, which he made on 5th April 2019 at Prague. I picked up out of the speech a very revealing two sentences. He said, "I state clearly and with conviction America's commitment to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. I am not naive. This goal will not be reached quickly, perhaps not in my lifetime. In a simplest manner, or in one liner, I can say, again, I can concur or repeat this goal. I mean here nuclear disarmament or weapons of mass destruction disarmament, or you can say including conventional disarmament will not be reached quickly, perhaps not in our lifetime. What are the barriers in this, or why I'm sounding so pessimistic? I have identified 5 reasons for it. Let me share those 5 reasons. But in a simplest manner, one can say anarchist structure of the international politics, statism, or what you call it, states still defining their national security with the perspective of traditional security paradigm, or despite this COVID-19, my previous speaker, both senior speakers have very rightly pointed out that the COVID-19 or infectious diseases, or especially Tariq Roof added this climate change, they are a big challenge. But these two big challenges? I mean that pandemic as well as climate change has reversed the order of nuclear modernization. My understanding is no. If we start tracing reviewing the Russians' military doctrine, looking the America's nuclear posture review revealed in February 2018, and seeing the other developments, India, Pakistan, Britain, we find that yes, world is facing a big challenge, COVID-19, but still the nations have been spending more in the military buildup and lesser thinking about nuclear or complete disarmament. So in this context, the first point is a state's security would be very sensitive to cheating. A state without nuclear weapons could be at huge disadvantage if suddenly facing an adversary that had one or more nuclear weapons that could be used for coercion or actual destruction. So that's why the states still consider in this current anarchical international society nuclear weapons as a guarantee for their defense. In this context, what we have to keep in mind that if the states are not going to address this domestic or this kind of a thinking, then it's difficult for thinking about disarmament. Second, Article 6 of the nuclear, you can say Non-Proliferation Treaty, which very rightly pointed about the Tariq Roof Saab. If you see, the persuasion is for good faith on measures working toward nuclear disarmament. The nuclear weapon states have failed to meet their Article 6 commitment, and that weakens, and that's still, you can say, qualify what India started saying since 1968 or 1970. NPT is a discriminatory treaty. In this context, the third barrier is a state with an advantage in defenses. Here, I can borrow a word by the ambassador. You can say that he very rightly pointed out when he was pointing out that ABM system. Interestingly, a state with an advantage in the defenses would be less vulnerable and maybe therefore less deterred from using its own offensive weapons. An advantage in the missile defense would compel the adversary to build a larger nuclear force to gain the ability to inflict the unacceptable damage. They need to ensure the survivability and penetrability of their nuclear weapons, and in that context, again, it undermines the movement or desire for nuclear disarmament. And in this context, my fourth point is absent to limit the conventional forces. Yes, we have one agreement or a treaty, conventional force, a limitation on the conventional forces, but practically, if you see, the conventional forces have been increasing. States have been modernizing their conventional forces. SPIR Yearbook 2020 gives you a good details about the conventional buildup. So in this context, the challenge in this context is that the nuclear weapons could be employed to deter large conventional attack. A state can rely on nuclear weapons to deter conventional attack either against homeland or its allies. Countries such as Pakistan and North Korea, or of alliances such as NATO, which are not confident that they can deter the conventional attack, or unwilling, and that's why they are unwilling for nuclear disarmament. Interestingly, after the 27th February 2019, when India lost its 2 aircraft, we have seen that Prime Minister Modi jumped on the nuclear compellence strategy. When he lost his 2 attempts at the missiles level, at the conventional, I mean that at the army level as well as at the sea level, he start talking about nuclear weapons are not for Diwali. So that gives you the clear idea that even the conventionally advanced states are looking at nuclear weapons as a hedge against their, you can say, adversaries. In this context, again, United States, despite being a world dominant military power, still relies on nuclear weapons for extended deterrence. Earlier, Tariq Roof has pointed out Russia's current nuclear doctrine escalate to de-escalate, essentially a limited first-use doctrine to deter NATO's conventional attacks. India swapped its no first-use option with first use to check Pakistan quid pro quo plus strategy to defy. And at the same time, what is Pakistan quid pro quo plus strategy to defy India's escalation dominance? So all these things, I think, are the signaling that disarmament is not an option for the militarily insecure state. Finally, in this context, the most important thing is radical deterioration in political relations. Tariq Roof very rightly pointed out some kind of a new strategic competition is taking place. I agree here that the ideological, territorial, and nuclear competition that largely defined the Cold War were reduced or eliminated. But US and Russia relations are still not nearly good enough to support disarmament. Russian policy to exert control along its periphery, Georgia, Ukraine, and now in Afghanistan, worried the Americans. Besides, the China-US relations are becoming, or relationship is becoming more competitive. So what we have been seeing since the end of the Cold War, especially in the last phase of the 1990s, the Americans have been targeting, since the 1990s, targeting China. There are clear disagreement over Taiwan, human rights, etc. This political trajectory is toward competition and tension rather than excellent confidence building. So similar situation exists between the nuclear armed rivals, like India and Pakistan. So my understanding here is that states will be unwilling to disarm if they believe that political conflicts could lead to war. Weapons are largely a reflection of these political tensions, not to cause. So if you are thinking about that, let's successfully cope with the nuclear disarmament or adopt a holistic disarmament approach, then it requires mobilizing political forces across the world and building stronger structure for global governance that are more responsive to current needs. Practically, the current situation is not conducive for such governance framework. So what is the realistic account? The realistic account is that the nuclear disarmament seems unattainable in the prevailing global strategic environment. The nuclear armed states have adopted an apathetic approach towards the concept of nuclear zero or towards a global zero, because the intellectual and political movements in favor of a nuclear disarmament suffer from unconvincing rationales, inherent contradictions, and unrealistic expectations. The nuclear optimists maintain that nuclear weapons have existed for 75 years in the arsenals of nuclear armed states without being used and have created a strategic stability among the great powers. Therefore, nuclear disarmament and counter-proliferation efforts are irrelevant or even potentially harmful for global and regional peace. The practical choice seems that efforts should be directed at strengthening the safety and security of nuclear weapons, arms race stability, and crisis stability, minimizing the risk of destructive nuclear war. So the alternative to disarmament, which is more practical at present, is that we have to work to avoid the collapse of nuclear arms control structures that have regulated the strategic nuclear balance since 1972 between Moscow and Washington. The states with nuclear arsenals are modernizing them, rejecting nuclear weapons ban treaty, and failed to engage in any disarmament talks at conference on disarmament, whether it says PAROS, FMCT, negative security assurances, nuclear disarmament. So what we can say here in a conclusion, let me submit that the nuclear modernization plans of nuclear armed states accentuate that the nuclear forces' significant role in their defense policy making is very much a big hurdle against when you talk about nuclear disarmament. Therefore, the complete nuclear disarmament or complete holistic approach towards disarmament remains infeasible, at least for the foreseeable future. However, the nuclear weapon states are inclined towards nuclear confidence building measures and nuclear arms control. They negotiated nuclear confidence building measures and arms control agreements to avoid accidental and inadvertent use of nuclear weapons. While negotiating arms control treaties or agreements, historically speaking, the participating nations always remain cautious about their sovereign defense and advantageous position in global politics. Therefore, any approach for nuclear disarmament in the form of nuclear weapons free world or global zero or entry into force recently, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, proved rhetorical and temporary, rather than representing a serious efforts for eliminating such weapons from the world. So in my final words, I can say all these developments reveals or manifest that nuclear disarmament is, or simple disarmament is thinking about fool's paradigm. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jaspal. Always, unlike always, very, very comprehensive presentation. Thank you very much. Our last panelist is Mr. Muhammad Kamran Akhtar Malik. He's the DG of Arms Control and Disarmament at Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He will be discussing nuclear disarmament between idealism and realism. Sir, the floor is yours.
We have Mr. Kamran Akhtar online, but I'm not sure he's in front of his screen or not.
Hello, sir. We're trying to again connect with Mr. Kamran. There's some technical difficulty that we're facing right now. If please bear with us.
हेलो हाँ वो नहीं हो रहा मैं देख पा
Hello.
हेलो
Assalamu alaikum, sir.
जी वालेकुम सलाम
So we can hear you. Can you please switch off your video if it's possible?
actually I'm connecting to this webinar through a data connection because of security reasons they have disabled the Wi-Fi in my office. And therefore, my connection is a bit unstable, and I think it would be better if I keep my video turned off so that there is no additional disturbance.
Sir, if that's all right, that's all right. Sir, the floor is yours. You can start.
Ji, am I audible in any case? आवाज तो ठीक आ रही है ना?
Yes, sir, you're audible. We can hear you perfectly.
Okay, that's good. Okay, so first of all, thanks to the SVI for inviting me for today's webinar. And it has been a pleasure to be a part of this distinguished panel, which included Ambassador Tariq Usman Hyder and Dr. Zafar Jaspal and Dr. Tariq Roof. Being the last speaker, I have been put in a position where much of what I had to say has already been covered. However, it also provides me an opportunity to focus on some specifics rather than delving into the details which the previous speakers have very aptly covered. Let me begin. We all know, and as pointed out by the previous speakers, since the advent of nuclear age, we have witnessed a debate on the one hand between supporters of deterrence and on the other between those who propose a ban on nuclear weapons. In the initial years, the United Nations General Assembly served as a platform for articulating the international community's aspiration for a world free of nuclear weapons. However, the practical efforts of the nuclear possessor states, as well as the states allied to them in the form of defense pacts, remained focused on seeking stability through nuclear deterrence. Nuclear non-proliferation constituted a cornerstone and a concern on which the efforts of the international organizations such as the IAEA were centered. The adoption of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, as pointed out by previous speakers, was welcomed as the first concrete commitment on the part of nuclear weapon states towards nuclear disarmament. However, as has been said earlier, the NPT stopped short of defining a concrete roadmap for disarmament, and its Article 6 only placed a broad obligation on the nuclear weapon states to negotiate in good faith effective measures towards nuclear disarmament. This expectedly led to gradual buildup of frustrations for nuclear disarmament idealists. During the Cold War, we saw times when the nuclear possessor states sought to outnumber their adversaries through arms racing. Then there were times when, having realized the futility of arms racing, the leading possessor states agreed on measures for risk reduction. This era of treaties like SALT and START did witness some reduction in numbers and limitations on types of warheads and delivery systems. However, these steps for reduction nevertheless were in the context of risk reduction and maintaining deterrent stability rather than any altruistic pursuit of nuclear, general and complete nuclear disarmament. These reductions were bilateral. They had no participation of non-nuclear weapon states parties to the NPT. They were not internationally verifiable or reversible. So they did not meet the fundamental requirements as spelled out in the first special session on disarmament of the UN General Assembly or the NPT. In fact, the security considerations of the nuclear weapon states continued to be supreme. The nuclear weapon states, it may be noted, were not even willing to extend unconditional negative security assurances to non-nuclear weapon states. The indefinite extension of NPT in 1995 and the subsequent adoption of 13 practical steps for nuclear disarmament in 2000 were the high points in the history of NPT. Yet, that did not come to any concrete result in terms of nuclear disarmament. The nuclear possessor states or the NPT nuclear weapon states were careful that they only agree to those future steps which were cost-free for them. For example, a fissile material cut-off treaty would have not impacted the security option of nuclear weapon states, tons and tons of fissile material for nuclear weapons. This then understandably has generated frustration and disappointment among the non-nuclear weapon states.
Hello, sir. Hello. There seems to be a technical glitch.
Hello.
Yes, sir, you're back. We can hear you again, sir. Please continue.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know at what point I got cut off. I was talking about the 13 practical steps for nuclear disarmament, which were agreed during 2000. And yet these steps included many of the steps which were cost-free for the nuclear weapon states. As I said, understandably, this has generated a lot of disappointment among non-nuclear weapon states, and it resulted in the reinvigoration of the humanitarian campaign, which catalyzed the adoption of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is called the Ban Treaty. Contrary to the expectations attached to the Ban Treaty, and as Dr. Tariq Roof has mentioned, in my view, the treaty has, in fact, further divided the NPT camp. We see that none of the nuclear possessor states have signed on to the treaty along with umbrella states. Yes, they did lock themselves out of the negotiations, and it was not the treaty which locked these nuclear weapon states out. Yet the TPNW leaves many critical questions unanswered regarding the world free of nuclear weapons, a world which the treaty seeks to establish immediately. The treaty does not say how those security concerns of the states will be addressed, which in the first place led these states to rely on nuclear weapons. It also does not propose a mechanism for verification, nor does it say anything about how to deal with a world in which any state which breaks out of the treaty and rapidly reconstitutes its nuclear arsenal based on the existing extensive nuclear infrastructure and know-how, how to deal with that. So there are a lot of questions regarding the treaty which the proponents of the treaty have failed to answer. At the other end of the spectrum are states like France, US, and UK, which have unequivocally rejected the treaty. They have reaffirmed the salience of nuclear weapons in their national security. These statements, in fact, were at great variance platitude. So in that sense, the TPNW had seen the nuclear posture review. Hello, G, am I audible?
Yes, sir. You were there was some audio problem before, but now you're audible.
Well, I was saying that how the TPNW has divided the international community further, because nuclear weapon states like France, UK, and US have come up with statements which were very strong in terms of rejection of the treaty. And they underscored the salience of nuclear weapons in their security doctrines. And these statements were at variance with the long maintained platitudes of these states to nuclear disarmament. So in that sense, the treaty has undermined the consensus on disarmament rather than promoting it. Now, what the question then is, what is the meeting point between the idealism of the humanitarian campaign and policy? The answer to the question lies, in my view, in analyzing the failure of approaches which were followed hitherto by the international community, and the factors which have been challenging progress at the UN disarmament forums. The SSOD1 adopted nearly after a decade of the adoption of NPT does provide some clues regarding elements of a possible successful approach. And this was mentioned by Ambassador Tariq Usman Hyder as well. To begin with, the SSOD1 recognized the link between nuclear disarmament and security concerns of the states. It also recognized the link between nuclear disarmament and conventional weapons. It also very duly observed that outstanding disputes have to be worked out between states if an environment conducive to nuclear disarmament was to be created. It talked about collective security mechanisms, and also, very importantly, it talks about internationally verifiable steps towards nuclear disarmament. And nuclear verification is one more element which is still not very fully developed. And without it, we cannot envisage a world free of nuclear weapons, because there will be no guarantees against a breakout by any state which wants to. Then we see that different UN forums dealing with disarmament have been focused on specific aspects of the broader problem of the international security environment. For example, the Conference on Disarmament was focusing solely on nuclear disarmament. The focus on outer space, a treaty on the prevention of arms race in outer space did not match the focus on fissile material. That there are platforms like the CCW, the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, which deal with conventional weapons, but there is no linkage or coordination with the CD. And the focus here too again remains on banning certain categories of weapons based on their excessively damaging nature for human beings, rather than on weapons which undermine strategic stability and on their arms control framework. So then again, there has been no coordination between the CD and the debate on United Nations collective security mechanisms, which is carried out in the Security Council. In the CD, we have hardly seen any reference to dispute resolution mechanisms of the UN in the context of debate on nuclear disarmament. And as we see the current scenario, which was duly highlighted by the previous speakers, we have an international security environment which is seeing the erosion of existing treaty framework. We are seeing modernization programs by the nuclear weapon states. We see the introduction of new and emerging technologies, which will further undermine strategic stability. It will increase the reliance of nuclear weapons on reliance of states on nuclear weapons who have been left behind in terms of these emerging technologies. We already see there are nuclear doctrines of the nuclear weapon states which talk about possible nuclear responses to cyber attacks. So all of these elements are adding to the uncertain international security mix. We don't see any desire on the part of the technology holders to accept any regulations on new and emerging technologies, because in their view, any new regulations will only take away their advantage in terms of development of these technologies. And therefore, we see that the environment at the international level is not very conducive, despite of the nuclear disarmament idealists. We also see crises in the BWC and CWC, the Biological Weapons Convention and the Chemical Weapons Convention regimes. And the OPCW is marred by increasing politicization. Similarly, we see crisis in the BWC regime as well. There is no verification mechanism. And after COVID pandemic, we have seen that how a biological attack is possible and how a biological attack might undermine the security and stability at the international level. Yet there is no move towards integrating the debate on these regimes into the debate on nuclear disarmament, whereas many nuclear weapon states in their nuclear doctrines link the possibility of their nuclear usage by chemical or biological with the chemical or biological attacks. What can be done? Number one, which Pakistan has always maintained, the CD needs to come out of stagnation. And by stagnation, I don't mean a lack of consensus on one or other odd item on the CD's agenda. The CD has to take a comprehensive view of the international security environment. It should include the debate on space-based capabilities of states which are linked to nuclear capabilities. It should look at regulation of new and emerging technologies. It should look at conventional arms control, and all this should be integrated with the debate on nuclear disarmament. Historically, we have seen that possessor states have given up any kind of weapon system when the utility of such weapon system is lost, or the adversaries come up with similar weapon systems. Only then they have agreed to make a movement towards disarmament of certain types of weapon systems like the chemical weapons or the biological weapons. We might see this again in terms of nuclear weapons once the countries are assured that their capabilities in terms of emerging technologies match their nuclear capabilities. So the only one prospect for nuclear disarmament to me is that countries which possess mastery over emerging technologies, they reach their emerging technologies capabilities is equivalent to their existing nuclear capabilities. And I think many nuclear weapon states like Pakistan will have to think about such a scenario. Finally, as a medium-sized state,
Hello, Mr. Malik. Hello. There seems to be some technical difficulties with Mr. Kamran's presentation. Presently, we're trying to get him back. If you can wait for it. Dr. Cheema, Dr. Cheema, it seems that Mr. Kamran has a very technical problem with his internet.
I think we can conclude the seminar and go to the question and answer session.
With your permission, sir. Sir,
please go ahead.
Sir, thank you. I would like to request our participants to please state their affiliations as well as direct the questions to our worthy panelists. The first question is from Dr. Adil Sultan, who is the acting dean. We seem to have Mr. Kamran back with us. Hello, sir. Hello. Sir, can you hear us? Hello. Sir, can you hear us?
I think even if he joins us, we can request him to conclude it now.
Yes, sir. If Mr. Malik can hear us, sir, we would request if you can conclude so we can move towards question and answers.
We will consider that concluded and then move forward.
All right, sir. All right, sir. So the first question that we have is from Dr. Adil Sultan, who is the Acting Dean of Strategic Studies Department of Air University, Islamabad, and it is directed to Dr. Tariq Roof. He says, how do you view a recent UK decision to increase the numbers of warheads, and how will it affect its commitment towards NPT Article 6? And what is the likely reaction by the non-NPT states? The second question from Dr. Adil Sultan is also directed towards Dr. Tariq Roof, and he questions what is the likely outcome of JCPOA. Dr. Roof, the floor is yours for the answer, sir.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Dr. Adil Sultan for the two excellent questions. It is quite clear that at the NPT review conference, the UK decision to increase its nuclear weapons will be a major issue, and it will further complicate the possibility of having an agreed outcome on further steps on nuclear disarmament to be agreed by the NPT review conference moving forward from 2021 to 2025, which is the next review period. Also, the United Kingdom hasn't really clearly justified the reason why it needs to increase its nuclear weapons. And further to add to the complication, as I just mentioned, people like me, we will highlight that the United Kingdom, when it makes its new nuclear warhead for the new nuclear submarines and the new submarine-launched ballistic missiles, will be based on the W93 warhead under development by the United States, and there will be a sharing of design information, which would be a clear violation of Article 1. I'm actually quite surprised that the NAM delegations, the non-aligned movement delegations, are not alert to this, and they seem to be asleep at the switch. With regard to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, it is clear that the Biden administration has fumbled this issue. I am actually quite concerned at this naive optimism about the Biden administration's role in arms control. We have seen that Mr. Biden has taken to insulting foreign leaders. He's insulted the Russian president. He's insulted the Chinese president. He's insulted other leaders. He's criticized the Iranians. And so he's sort of, in a sense, polluting the same place that he wants people to negotiate with him. On the other hand, Bob Malley, who is the special advisor for Iran, he has a clear policy that the JCPOA must be resurrected. Ballistic missiles and regional issues must be dealt with separately. This is not the view of the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, and the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, but it seems that the US will end up in that position as they now seem to understand that the JCPOA is the only way forward for constraining further developments in Iran's uranium enrichment program. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the answer, sir. Our next question is from Amber Abid, who is the research associate at the SVI. The question is directed towards Ambassador Tariq Hyder. She questions the discriminatory attitude of NPR is damaging the South Asian regional stability. What measures could be taken to address this challenge? Sir.
Could you repeat it? I'm sorry, I couldn't quite catch what the question was. Okay, sorry.
Sir, the question is that the discriminatory attitude of NPR is damaging the South Asian regional stability. What measures can Pakistan take to address this challenge?
Did you say MTCR or what did you say?
So the discriminatory attitude of non-proliferation regime is damaging the South Asian regional stability.
NPT, I said NPT regime, yeah. Well, I think for us, the main problem is access to civil nuclear technology. And our quest has been to join the NSG. That is the main thing. And in this, it is not the majority of the NPT states, while some are a bit hesitant about it, people like Brazil and Argentina more than hesitant, but it is the nuclear powers, the P4, apart from China, who are in varying degrees not supportive of our desire to join the NSG. If one could join the NSG, then there's not much in the NPT which would hold us back in civil nuclear cooperation.
Thank you very much, sir. The next question is from NMA Khan, and it is directed towards Dr. Jaspal. She questions, what quid pro quos can Pakistan offer to get access to nuclear technology through multilateral export control cartels? Also, how to get membership in those cartels, which India has already become a member of. Dr. Jaspal.
Thank you very much. I think that in the case of these four cartels, if you can go with the like MTCR, Australia group, as well as this, what we call it, Wisner arrangement, and partially India got the waiver also we call it partial member, but from the nuclear SPIR group. Unfortunately, Pakistan missed the train. And it's missed the opportunities because for the first three which I named, Pakistan did not apply for a membership. Yes, in the case of NSG, in 2016 summer, we applied for membership. So if Pakistan has to become a member or benefit from these charters, first Pakistan has to prepare itself, chalk out its strategy, and approach these charters one by one separately, and then go for quid pro quo type of arrangements. In this context, of course, theoretically speaking, Pakistan has the capability, like the other many states which are a member of these charters, to become a member and assist the international community for peaceful use of these dual-use technologies. But at the same time, in the case of NPT, of course, now they have attached the NPT membership, but at the same time, there is a discriminatory approach. The situation is entirely not conducive because the moment we apply, India will be going to veto where it is member. And then if we have to accommodate the India, how we try to establish this sort of thing within the NSG framework. So apart from that, first of all, we must be prepared ourselves. Frankly speaking, I haven't seen any official document except when you have applied for the NSG in summer 2016 on the other three charters, that whether or what is our official argument and how we built our academic argument. Thank you.
Thank you for the answer, Dr. Jaspal. Our next question is from Sher Bano Khan, who is the research affiliate at SVI. The question is addressed to Ambassador Tariq Usman Hyder. The question is it possible to suggest to international community to focus more on the vertical proliferation and instead steer the debate more towards the main objectives of nuclear export control and NSG, that is to halt horizontal proliferation, where the case of Pakistan makes more sense? Ambassador?
Yes. Not quite sure if I'm clear what the worthy questioner is saying is to link it to vertical non-proliferation or horizontal non-proliferation.
Sir, if I may repeat the question again, the question goes as, is it possible to suggest to international community to focus more on vertical proliferation and instead steer the debate more towards the main objective of the nuclear export control and NSG, that is to halt horizontal proliferation, where the case of Pakistan makes more sense?
I'm not really quite sure that one can make a case for that, because the countries which have got the most nuclear weapons are very reluctant to vertically deproliferate, as you can see, especially now with England. And secondly, in our case, the argument is not so much, the question is not so much argumentation, but it's really a political issue that countries like America, France, UK are not keen that Pakistan develops its civil nuclear power or its nuclear capabilities at all. And therefore, that kind of an argument to distract or whatnot, I don't think would make much difference.
Sir,
I can add here?
Please, sir.
I would like to add. I think that in this context where it has been raised this question that Pakistan will contribute horizontally or vertically, we have to go for Pakistan's official stance on fissile material cutoff or FMT negotiation at the Conference of Disarmament. Pakistan clearly mentioned that you have to cut the fissile material, address the existing as well. Naturally, when we talk about officially cut, it means that you are talking about banning, capping the vertical and then going for reversing it. If you are addressing the existing one, it addresses both vertical and horizontal, you can proliferate.
Sir, thank you very much.
Yes, Dawood, this is Kamran. I would like to add a word about this.
Please, sir.
I think that the US attempt to engage China in the existing US-Russia talks on arms control of nuclear weapons. I think in that context, China is drawing attention towards vertical proliferation when it maintains a position that it will only join any such talks once the two leading possessor states have reduced to the level of the Chinese arsenal. Only then can they join. And in that sense, the Chinese position makes a lot of sense because they say that vertical proliferation is equally a problem than a horizontal proliferation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the answer, sir. The next question is from Mr. Imran Afzal, and it is directed to Mr. Tariq. He says there is an unending and unsettled debate that either the world should opt for total nuclear disarmament or some sort of nuclear arms reduction, and how to go about is the matter of choice. And the opposing ideologies have never been able to agree on more common agenda. However, the common concern that the non-usage of nuclear weapons should be made the basic agenda point of such type of effort to get a fruitful result from such conferences. Is it a viable option in your opinion, sir?
Is this addressed to me or to Tariq Roof, sir?
Sir, there is seems to be an ambiguity. You can answer as well as Dr. Tariq Roof can answer the question.
Well, I let Dr. Tariq Roof go first, I think.
Sir,
he's more eloquent than me.
I'm not more eloquent than you, Ambassador, but did you just summarize the question again? Because sort of I lost track.
Sir, he says that there is an unending and unsettled debate that either the world should opt for total nuclear disarmament or some sort of nuclear arms reduction.
Yes. So arms reduction is considered to be a pathway to achieving a world without nuclear weapons, which we know is not going to happen in the foreseeable future. And therefore, the focus is on reducing the numbers of nuclear weapons, because if one talks about reducing the risks of nuclear weapons, or quote unquote risk reduction, the more nuclear weapons there are, and the more nuclear weapons that are on ready to launch status, the higher the risks. So if we reduce the numbers of nuclear weapons, as well as the ones on ready alert, one is also to a certain extent reducing the risks from inadvertent, deliberate, or accidental use of nuclear weapons. I wanted to come back on a couple of other points very quickly. With regard to the nuclear supplies group in Pakistan, it's the point I've made in a previous SVI webinar as well. While Pakistan, I think, should continue to knock at the door of the NSG, we should understand that there is only one nuclear supplier for Pakistan, and that is China. Pakistan cannot afford to buy reactors from Russia, from Rosatom, because they are too expensive. The Koreans will not sell reactors to Pakistan because they are licensed from the United States. Westinghouse is no longer in the business of producing reactors. It is owned by Hitachi. Similarly, General Electric is no longer in the business of making reactors. It's owned by Toshiba. The US has not made a new nuclear reactor, power reactor, for decades. The only ones coming on stream are ones that whose construction had started a long time back. So the only viable supplier for Pakistan is the China National Nuclear Corporation, which is the supplier for the power reactors in Pakistan. So the choke point for Pakistan is getting uranium for the fueling of these power reactors. And again, I think China can be the source for that. And finally, with regard to the TPNW, the criticism about verification, I understand, but we should understand that we will never, ever, ever be in a situation where there will be international verification of the dismantlement and destruction of nuclear warheads. So this would be the only practical way forward is the South Africa model, where each country with nuclear weapons would dismantle its own nuclear weapons. The nuclear material would go under international verification. And the one argument that the opponents to nuclear disarmament use that was cited by Dr. Jaspal, and I'm not criticizing Dr. Jaspal here, I'm criticizing that argument that in a disarmed world, a country with 1 or 5 nuclear weapons would hold the world hostage. Well, should that happen, that country would be hammered with precision-guided conventional weapons to take out that capability. So that is a straw man that is raised by the opponents to nuclear disarmament from the nuclear weapon states and the states relying on extended deterrence. Thank you.
Sir, thank you very much. We have a lot of questions.
Can I interfere, Dawood? Are you listening to me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think General Lodi wants to come on the panel. Are you in contact with him?
Sir, no, sir. I have asked him, but I can ask Zishan to ensure that Dr. General Lodi is included in panel.
Just doing
Okay.
that, sir.
Nishan, are you in contact with General Lodi?
Sir, we
Yes,
have
Assalamu alaikum.
General
Well, you
Lodi
can
General
on
Lodi
panel.
is now part of the panel.
Yeah.
Thank you very much,
Please, General
sir.
Lodi,
Thank you very much, sir. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, we
Yes,
can
sir.
hear you.
Thanks a lot, sir. First of all, congratulations, SVI and Dr. Cheema sir for organizing this seminar, and a very important one. And then asking such eminent speakers to speak on that. And special thanks to Tariq sir for being with us from abroad. I only want to make 2 points. One is that we all understand that because of, as Americans call it, revisionist China and resurging Russia, the entire world order, whether it is political or economic or strategic, it is under some stress. And some of the very eminent countries are actually showing some ill discipline as far as agreements and conventions are concerned. And I don't have to go into detail; we are all aware of it, and I'm sure that our audience will also understand. Making an agreement and then not abiding to it, this has become a norm, which is dangerous. So this is one point. Until and unless this world order settles for a more robust framework, and everybody is forced to, or at least asked to abide by the rules and the convention and everything, I think even this non-proliferation and disarmament things will remain under stress. That is one point which I would like to make. The second is that, in my opinion, the means of deterrence may not be nuclear anymore. With the passage of time, other technologies are coming up, and somebody mentioned it also. And some of them are even more, we can say, damaging than the nuclear thing. And I'm alluding to, some biological warfare things which are coming up, and genetical modification, climate control, and all these things. So, in my opinion, in the next 5 to 10 years, we will stop talking about nuclear proliferation and NPT and such. I think that some more serious things might come up. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, General Lodi.
Thank you very much, sir. So we have only 2 minutes left.
We can have last 1 or 2 questions.
Sir, the last question is from Dr. Adil Sultan, and it is directed towards Mr. Kamran Akhtar. He says, can Mr. Kamran Akhtar clarify Dr. Jaspal's comments on the other 3 export control regimes, where Dr. Jaspal stated that Pakistan missed the bus? He says, as per his understanding, our approach toward export control regimes, especially the NSG, was not necessarily guided by the Indian actions. And we do not do things to emulate India. NSG was vital, whereas for the other 3, we need to be realistic about our own requirements as well as international environment. In the end, all these are political regimes. If Mr. Kamran Akhtar want to please answer Dr. Sultan.
Well, thank you. I think the last part of Dr. Adil Sultan's question is a part of the answer as well. These regimes are highly political, And because of the political reasons, we did not apply for the other three regimes, although we have an interest in joining them. Yet, if we look at India's joining of these regimes, it was as a result of understanding between the promoters of India and the members of these regimes that India will be given the membership of these regimes, and only subsequent to such an understanding, India applied for membership. Now, we didn't want ourselves to be in a position where we apply and our application is turned down by one or other member of these regimes, since these regimes operate on the basis of consensus. And had that been the case, it would have weakened our case for the NSG membership, because it would have set a precedent that one of the state is admitted while leaving the other out. So in order to avoid such an eventuality based on political considerations, we just focused on our membership of the NSG. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Dr. Cheema, I think we are about to close it, so I would request you to please say the closing
Well,
remarks.
thank you very much. I'd like to be profoundly thankful to the distinguished panelists who has made not only very comprehensive, but very highly educative and worth learning presentations. I think all the presentations were excellent, and we learned a lot from those presentations. And I think it was a very useful debate on non-proliferation disarmament which has taken place on current status. So my thankfulness to all of you, and wish you good. I'm particularly thankful to participants as well, and wish you good luck. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.